Here with me to my right, he was shaking his head as Doug was giving his report. I'm sure Richard Fowler is listening in there in D.C. So, Richard, good morning to you. Let Bob go ahead and react first.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Wow. Well, there are several things to say about this, but the most important thing to say is that when you're looking at a problem as complex as we have here, two things are true. You can't start the dialogue by saying, but everything that's critical is off the table. I'm only going to negotiate with you about what I'm going to negotiate with you about. I really find that offensive, and I wish I could talk to Eric Cantor face to face and ask him, does he really think it's a good idea for the people of Missouri to be subsidizing the mansions in Greenwich of people who are using the mortgage interest deduction to reduce their income taxes? There are things that even rock Republicans that I know very well understand have to be put back on the table for discussions on the revenue side of this thing. The second thing to say is disparaging the Gang of Five is a terrible thing to do, because you can't get to a very complicated answer to a complicated question in public all the time. And if anybody, I've spent my life negotiating complex transactions. You can't have every single issue subject to criticism by everybody who's seen it and talking about it. Sometimes
it's an ongoing process.
It's a process.
And then you don't want to put pressure on someone to perhaps not compromise when they may be thinking
exactly.
And they're always playing to their
the whole point of compromise is you've got to give me something, I got to give you something. And if the mere fact that I offer something to you becomes front page news, it never gets offered.
Nobody can save face. Richard, what do you say?
For once, I could say I agree with Mr. Rice. He's completely correct. You cannot have negotiations about the budget without actually negotiating. And sadly, House Republicans just refuse to negotiate with the president. I'm hoping, and I'm assuming they're going to change their tune pretty quickly to see what happened in the New York 26 last night, where the Democrats stood strong and we sent a message that, this is a referendum on Paul Ryan's budget and hurting our retirees across the country. And that is what we need to work on going into the next coming 18 months. This is the beginning of, the election cycle here, and the win in the 26 shows that Democrats are really willing to negotiate, and they're really willing to create bipartisan solutions to our budget issues in Washington, and sadly House Republicans just aren't.
Well, I'm sure someone would disagree with that.
Here's what I'd like to say. I would like to say something about that. Yeah. I don't want to see the Democrats now overinterpret the results of that election yesterday. I mean, the Republicans overinterpreted the results of the previous election and went all one way. Now the Democrats are in danger of overinterpreting yesterday's reaction and going to the far extreme. Spending cuts and entitlement programs must occur. I don't care what happened in the upstate New York election. They must occur. Some tax revenue increases have to occur. Both these things are simply true.
And then what do you think about the top story that Doug McElway reported on? The House GOP leadership announced that they will hold a vote next week to increase the debt ceiling by $2.4 billion, no strings attached.
Well, that'll take care of about 15 minutes of debt. So, of interest payments. So, what that probably shows you is something that, despite all the rhetoric, even the hardcore Republicans understand that the reality is you cannot play with this kind of fire. This is playing with nuclear weapons to talk about the U.S. defaulting on its debt. Because as we've discussed on this program before, if that even becomes a realistic possibility, and it doesn't have to happen, it only has to become a realistic possibility. And at that point, interest rates are going to shoot to the moon. And that's going to cripple the federal government. It's going to cause everyone's mortgage payments to reset upwards. And then you're going to have one unhappy electorate.
Richard?
He's completely correct. If we don't raise the debt ceiling, playing chicken with the debt ceiling is playing chicken with the American dream and playing chicken with all of our businesses and all the new jobs that we've created under the Obama administration. We have to raise the debt ceiling in order for us to preserve our way of life as Americans. The trickle down effect of not raising the debt ceiling, like you said, is an increase of interest rates across the country and also destabilization in the world economy. We are key to the world economy, and if we decide that we're going to basically debunk on all of our debt or default on all of our debt, then other countries are going to go crazy, the markets are going to go haywire, and you're going to cause a double dip recession. And that's exactly what we don't need going into the next coming years. The question that we have to ask ourselves is, what are we going to do for the next 18 months on this new budget that we're working on, and how are we going to increase revenue while also decreasing spending? And that's the most important thing. And I think the president in the Winning the Future budget has presented just that, a way that we can decrease spending and also increase revenue. First thing we need to do is we need to close some of these big loopholes in tax subsidies tax subsidies to major oil companies. We also have to, we have to go back on the tax cuts for the rich created under George W. Bush, and in turn for that, we can create some exchanges and some give and take on how we reform Medicare and make Medicare work for our current retirees and people in my generation when they retire.
And Richard, but you say give and take. Do you really do you believe and feel strongly that there will be give and take at the end of the day, or do you think that politics will rule? Because I'd imagine there are some people who just don't want to have the president reelected, so they're going to try to not have him, succeed on any front. I don't know. Is that far-fetched?
That's not far-fetched. I mean, that's what the president, the minority whip in the Senate has stated explicitly that his number one goal is to defeat President Obama. So it's not a far-fetched thing to say at all.
No, it's not far-fetched at all. You're completely right. I think on our side of Pennsylvania Avenue, we're willing to negotiate. The president in the current budget shaved $61 billion worth of spending. He's willing to give and take. Sadly, John Boehner and his colleagues aren't willing to do the same. The president's willing to come to the negotiation table. He sent his top negotiator, Joe Biden, over to the Congress to create some sort of agreement so that we can work on getting a budget that would actually not only invest in America's future and win America's future, but also, create spending cuts that would please House Republicans and Senate Republicans. And sadly, we have senators like Jeff Sessions who are not willing to work with the Gang of Five. We have Tom Coburn who says he's not working with the Gang of Five. We have John Boehner. We have Eric Cantor said it's a non-starter for him. So you just see that there's a disparity in that we're willing to work together to create real bipartisanship solutions, and they're just not.
Well, it's not clear to me. We're in agreement on most issues here. It still, frankly, is not clear to me because the president has not done a good enough job in articulating what his leadership position is. That the kinds of cuts you're talking about are minor. They're not impressive. They're nothing like what we need to accomplish in this country to really put our fiscal house in order. So I think it's slightly disingenuous to say, well, the Democrats are all willing to negotiate and the Republicans aren't. If President Obama wanted to lead on this, he could. He could come out tomorrow and say, you know what I'm going to support? I'm going to support rolling back the retirement age for Social Security by 2 years for people under 50. That, by itself, would make a huge difference, and it would send a signal that he's really serious about putting things that are painful on the table that are going to really help this. And if he was, in my opinion, if he were a great president on these kinds of domestic issues, he would be showing that kind of leadership, which so far he hasn't.
This is where I disagree. The president has shown that kind of leadership. He's instructed Secretary Gates to cut $100 billion from the defense budget. Those are painful cuts. The fact that we're cutting parts, we're decreasing the size of our defense department, that's a painful cut that the president's been willing to make. On top of that, the president's been willing to put aside a lot of the programs that he said he was going to come in to do in order to make cuts that are going to really help our country grow. So I think he's been willing to make painful cuts. On top of that, the president said he's willing to roll back the Bush tax cuts for the top 2% of Americans. A lot of those top 2% of Americans are some of the president's donors, the people that gave to the president in 2008. And he's willing to say, we have to raise your taxes because it has to be a shared sacrifice. It can't just be a sacrifice on the middle class. It can't just be a sacrifice on the working class. It has to be a sacrifice that is spread across the board. And the president has been very clear that everybody has to make a sacrifice, and he's showed that. Sadly, I just don't feel as though the Republicans are willing to make, or the House Republicans are willing to make those type of painful cuts.
I'm going to remind everybody about today's FoxNews.com Live You Decide question. It is, if convicted, should Casey Anthony get the death penalty? Yes, no, or you're not sure. So please chime in. We'll try to get you some results at the end of this hour. Let's talk about this right now in the Wall Street Journal. Today, this is by Shelby Steele. Obama's unspoken re-election edge. This presidency flatters America to a degree that no white Republican can hope to match. Pulling out an excerpt from this now. The problem Mr. Obama poses for Republicans is that there has always been a disconnect between his actual performance and his appeal. Goes on to say the Republicans are running against the man and the myth. And then it goes on to say here, the point is that anyone who runs against Mr. Obama will be seen through the filter of this racial impression in which white skin is redundant and the dark skin is fresh and exceptional. This is the new cultural charisma that the president has introduced into American politics. You say what, Bob?
I am so shocked and offended by that article. I can't believe that it was put into the Wall Street Journal. It makes my blood boil. That's all I can really say about it. There are so many fallacies in the argument that it's hard to list them all. One of the things, though, I find really offensive is the idea that, and I think is racist, profoundly racist, is the idea that President Obama, the man in the myth, he's really, and the argument here is he's not really. It's complete fallacy. His image is completely divorced from the reality of the situation. And the example he uses, weirdly, is he went and killed Osama bin Laden. Oh, sure. But the reality is he's been a big chicken and a big wimp up until that time. That is false. He prosecuted these wars in the Middle East far more aggressively than George Bush ever did. He used the CIA and drones far more aggressively than the previous president ever did. The difference is that President Obama follows the walk softly and carry a big stick, and which I think is the intelligent way to approach international negotiations, that Teddy Roosevelt championed. So now we have a black man as president of the United States, and when he follows the same strategy, people like this author, I believe, are unwilling to recognize and acknowledge his great leadership because I think they are inherently racist and they can't see what the man is actually accomplishing. So they have to themselves invent a myth that his myth is different than his reality. I have many problems with this president, as I just articulated. And I articulate on this show very frequently. But this is the kind of thing that makes me crazy.
Richard?
Well, I agree in some parts and I disagree in others. I think Bob is right that this article does go a little bit too far. But what the article does talk about, and what I think the part that's the most important, is that the Republican field just seems to be very weak when it comes to pizzazz. I mean, I wouldn't really say a white man or not white man. I think there's no candidate that
speaks. But that's what she says.
That's what she says, and that's not what I would say. I would say there's just no pizzazz, no charisma coming out of the Republican field right now. Nothing to get excited about. And what the Democrats have is they have a president that has had the ability to excite the base, to rally young people, to rally African Americans, to rally Latinos, and to rally independents. And the Republicans just don't have that candidate yet. I think they're looking for it. I don't think they've quite found it yet. And until they find that candidate, it's going to be very hard for them to put up a real challenge to President Barack Obama. I just don't think Mitt Romney is that particular person. And I think, maybe Mitch Daniels could have been that person, but he's now out. Maybe Mike Huckabee could have been that person, but he's now out. So the field is just sort of very weak. And it's very reminiscent to me of, the 1996 and Bill Clinton and the Bob Dole race. They just don't really have a really strong candidate that can pose a threat to President Obama going into the next 18 months. Hopefully they find one pretty quickly.
And of course, Shelby, pardon me, is a male. I referenced she, but I stand corrected. He is a male.
I think you're doing a great job of sticking on the Democratic talking points there. And of course, this is an excellent way of pointing out that, in fact, the Republicans, obviously, it's well known that the Republican establishment is not happy so far with the list of candidates. And that's a very fair point and an accurate point. But my underlying point is this article is not about that. This article is claiming that Barack Obama has an inherent advantage. And of course, the irony, being a Southerner by background, the irony here is just tremendous that the Wall Street Journal is arguing that the president has an inherent advantage because he is black.
Yeah. Does it change the argument in your mind because Shelby Steele's father is black and his mother is white? Does that change that argument?
It doesn't. It doesn't to me at all. I mean, making this about race, explicitly, implicitly, whether it's it's traditional racism or reverse racism. Who cares about that? I mean, that kind of stuff makes me nuts. Let's focus on the reality of what this man has done in office and what he has not done in office, and let's argue about that.
Right. Richard, I'm going to lose your satellite in about a minute, so I'll give you some chance to make some final comments.
Well, thanks for having me on the show. I had a great time. This is the first time I've actually been on the show where I had a Republican strategist that usually agrees with me on most things. So I'm happy for that one. I think he's sort of there's a lot. This article, it has to be a deeper conversation that you have over a cup of coffee, and not necessarily a conversation that you can have in a short interview. I think we have to dissect this article and take it piecemeal and sort of figure out where the author is really trying to go with this.
And but where do you think, though? Yeah, you just sort of.
Sure. For me, I think the author is trying to make it clear that the president has a lot of charisma. He's seen as the youth president. He's seen as the person that sort of can rally folks. He has this very rock starish figure to him, this rock starish image that has played very well for him. And I think the Republicans, what I concluded from is that the Republicans need to find that rock star-esque candidate to compete with another rock star. And sadly, they just don't have it right now.
All right, Richard, what are you up to today there in D.C.?
It's a busy day here. Hopefully I'll get a chance to read the transcript from the president's speech.
Yeah, he's making it right now.
And work on producing an op-ed that you can catch on richardafowler.com.
All right, Richard Fowler, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.